just like the Prime Minister's hair has been extended, the Canadian government has officially announced that the CERB program has been extended for Canadians. And I'm sure that this comes as welcome news to some of you who are nearing the end of your 16-week period that you can receive the CERB for. So today, I'd like to get you up to speed on a few different things, and those are what this CERB extension actually is and how it's going to affect you. I want to also talk about some talk of universal basic income that I've seen, and I'd also like to address the question of who's going to pay for all of this. So let's get into it. On Tuesday, June 16th, the government officially announced that the CERB program will be extended by another 8 weeks. So this works out to be another 2 months worth of CERB that you can receive money for, which brings the grand total of the entire program to 6 months that you can receive payments for. This brings the total benefit from $8,000 up to $12,000. So you'll be able to get an additional $4,000 in this extension. So the CERB payment hasn't changed. It's still saying at that $2,000 per month. They're just adding an additional $4,000 to this program for people who still can't find work after 6 months. So basically what's happened here is the CERB initially started out as a maximum period of 16 weeks that you could receive money for. And now that's been bumped up to 24 weeks. So let's say you were somebody who's receiving CERB from the very beginning. That meant that the period from March 15th to July 4th would have been your maximal period of time that you could receive your payments for. It's getting very close to July 4th right now, so you'd be kind of getting to the end of the road of your CERB payments. Let's take a look at this table to make things a little bit more clear about these eligibility periods. So these are the eligibility periods that you can receive your money in. Each period is 4 weeks long. So the first one began on March 15th, and you can see there's a total of 7 eligibility periods that end on September 26th. So initially, the idea was that you can apply for your CERB benefits for 4 of these periods in total. Maybe that meant that you started on the 2nd period, let's say, and then you'd go to the 6th period, for example. But now you can be covered across 6 of these periods, which for a lot of people could mean that you're going to be covered all the way until September 26th. As far as I know, there hasn't been any talk on extending anything past September 26th right now, but it seems to me that the way the government's been handling this is they'll kind of roll out a program, make a decision, and then from there they'll kind of collect and analyze the data, see how that was working, and then they'll make a new decision about how they should proceed going forward. So this extension of the CERB program came about as kind of like a review of their seeing how the economy is doing after this initial 4-month period. Should we extend it? And they've decided that they should. So it could be possible that we could see even another extension or another kind of evolution of the CERB program afterwards, but we'll have to see how everything continues to play out. The government has also voiced a stronger encouragement for those people who are receiving CERB that they should be looking for work actively while they're receiving the money. So they've said that in order to apply for this new round of CERB payments, you'll have to basically sign an attestation on the application that says that yes, you are in fact actively looking for employment right now. Obviously, the CERB isn't meant for people to just bum around on the couch with. It's meant to be a bridge to get people from being unemployed to employed. Another thing I wanted to bring up today was this pretty interesting opinion piece article that I read in Maclean's, and it was about the CERB basically being something that is possibly a precursor to universal basic income. And in the article, it interestingly points out that the Great Depression in the 1930s gave us the Bank of Canada, employment insurance, and federal equalization payments. And then it goes on to say that the Great Recession in 2008 gave us new developments in monetary policy and a more careful eye on household debt. So essentially, it's saying that these economic crises that we've faced in our past have kind of caused the creation of these new government entities or these new government programs that were then carried forwards into the future. So the article kind of makes a case, or at least it points out the possibility that something like CERB could be like the precursor or a template for something like universal basic income in the future. So it asks the question, will our new crisis cause the birth of universal basic income? It's a really interesting question. The article points out that the CERB program is completely unprecedented in Canada. We've never had widespread, rapid handouts of money from the government like this before. And as we've been moving through the crisis, the CERB has kind of been getting like reworked a little bit and tweaked as it was realized that some people fell through the cracks of it and then students weren't included and all sorts of stuff like that. So it's been an ongoing process of kind of refining the CERB. So could that ultimate revision be something like universal basic income? The article basically goes on to say that there's been some kind of pilot programs and stuff like that done across the globe where they've tried to implement universal basic income on a small scale, but all of these pilot programs have kind of had mixed results. Some show some positive qualities, some show some negative qualities, but we don't really have anything on like a massive scale to get lots of good data from. Until now. The article points out that the CERB is kind of like this laboratory, this scientific experiment that we can then now look at and collect all the data from and see how the CERB influenced things like spending habits and all sorts of stuff like that to ultimately draw a more informed conclusion if universal basic income could be something beneficial for Canadians moving forwards. I'm curious to know what you think about that. If you have an opinion on it, I'd really like to hear it in the comments down below. Alright, so now let's get to the third topic. Who the heck is going to pay for all of this? As of June 4th, the CERB has costed Canada a total of $43.5 billion according to CTV News. It turns out that supporting basically a third of Canada's entire working population is pretty expensive. So expensive, actually, that it's possible Canada's debt could surpass $1 trillion this year, jumping up from around $768 billion. That's a huge jump, and the Canadian Taxpayers Federation estimates that this amount could be about $18,000 per Canadian. And if we take into account that our national debt level could rise and surpass $1 trillion, then that $18,000 per Canadian is going to jump up too. So how does this actually all work? Is our generation actually going to get stuck with a massive tax bill or something like that in the future? The truth is, federal debt, or like a country's debt, it's a pretty wonky subject to wrap your head around. It's really strange, but let's try and do it together. The first thing that we should look at here is our debt to GDP ratio. So for those of you who don't know what GDP is, it stands for gross domestic product. And you can kind of think of it as an approximation of the amount of wealth that a country produces in a given year. So by comparing the amount of wealth that a country produces versus the amount of debt that it has, we can kind of get an idea of how sustainable our debt levels are. Fortunately, Canada actually has the lowest debt to GDP ratio out of the G7 countries. Canada's is hovering somewhere around 30%, whereas somewhere like the United States, for reference, is about 106%. So our debt levels are very sustainable relative to our counterparts. But according to a simulation that was done by the Fraser Institute, we're likely going to see that ratio jump up to at least above 40% in a best case scenario, or go as high as 73% in a worst case scenario. That would be more than doubling of our current debt to GDP ratio. And that is due in part because our GDP is also going to decline as our debt levels go up, because the economy is slowing down and Canada is going to produce less wealth. Now, the next thing we'll have to wrap our heads around is a little bit weird. So we need to understand the difference between me, a person, and Canada, a country. So me, sadly, I'm going to die one day. Hopefully not before the ripe old age of 500 years old. I plan to have a really good go at life. But Canada, as a country, as the sovereign entity, can actually theoretically exist forever. A country doesn't necessarily have to die, ever. When we think about our own personal debt, like if I think about any debt that I have, we see it through the lens of a finite life. But when we look at government debt, we need to see it through the lens of an immortal life, if you will. And basically what that means is we need to look at government debt as something that's probably never ever going to reach zero, because there's no reason for it to ever reach zero. A government's debt should just basically be kept at a level that's sustainable so that the government can invest in the way it needs to, but also at the same time be able to pay the interest rate on that debt sufficiently. So actually, government debt will most likely continue to rise over time. It's probably not going to go down. But here's the thing. The actual value of that debt won't rise in proportion to the nominal value of that debt. And the reason why is because of inflation. So when we think about inflation, we know that inflation eats away at the value of money over time. Like if you just kept money under your mattress as cash, that cash would become worth less over time if you kept it under there for a long enough period of time. So when we stretch government debt over long periods of time, inflation actually eats away at the value of that debt over time. And in addition to that, a country's GDP, or the wealth that it produces, should also increase over time. So with those two forces, the force of inflation bringing down the value of debt and GDP increasing, that means that your debt to GDP ratio should always stay relatively sustainable. At least that's the operating hypothesis that governments around the world are going with these days, because the alternative would be to tax the heck out of the population, and somehow that's just not really popular with the voters. And with all that being said, that's going to be it for me today, guys. So I hope that you've learned about the CERB extension today. I hope you've got a little bit of a crash course in government debt as well. And if you found it helpful, I'd really appreciate if you hit the like button and subscribe if you're not already. If you live outside the GTA, then I hope you enjoy your stage 2 openings and your patios and all that nice stuff. I'll be here just left behind in the dust. But thank you for watching, and I will see you again soon.